Our final panel is on supporting news and quality information. And once again, we have three wonderful panelists and a fantastic moderator. Danielle Stone is Senior Legal Counsel at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, as well as President of the Canadian Media Lawyers Association. And she has a law degree from the University of Toronto and a Bachelor of Journalism honors degree from the University of King's College, as well as her own background as an award-winning investigative journalist. Kim Kierans is an English professor at the University of King's College, where she taught for 24 years and is also a senior fellow and resident at Massey College at the University of Toronto. She's also the vice chairperson of the Federal Independent Advisory Board on Eligibility for Journalism Tax Measures. Courtney Radsch is director of the Center for Journalism and Liberty at the Open Markets Institute. She's also previously a fellow at UCLA's Institute for Technology, Law and Policy, and part of that led advocacy and communications at the Committee to Protect Journalists. And our moderator, Alessia Zornetta, is an independent researcher who's been working on legal and economic questions related to press sustainability for several years, including at the Institute for Technology, Law and Policy at UCLA, which she remains affiliated. Alessia, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So yesterday during one of the sessions, we were asked to mention the themes and the main threats to democracy in Canada. And a lot of what was mentioned really resonates with the theme of our panel today. So some of the threats mentioned were, for example, the fragmentation of the media landscape, the lack of trust on pretty much everything, the constant competition for attention, and how disinformation and divisive, non-democratic tendencies really thrive in this environment. So today we will focus on the one core issue, and that is the independence and the resilience of journalism in this era of increased political pressure, eroding trust in news, and the impact of technology. So maybe you can start with Courtney. Some of the themes that resonated today dealt with, the financial structure of technology and platforms and how that impacts greater components of society. And thinking about news, advertising remains the main financial source of the digital economy. It shapes both how journalism is funded and how platforms, on the other hand, accumulate power. So thinking about transparency and accountability in online advertisement, how could it affect the balance between platforms and publishers if we were to think of ways to improve transparency and how platforms were accountable?
Thanks, Alessia, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So I'm going to quibble with the question because I think transparency is insufficient, right? So we've seen tech platforms adopt transparency reporting, but it is necessary but insufficient. So none of that transparency reporting includes any transparency around the ad tech online advertising system. There's a great little teeny tiny organization called Check My Ads, which is one of the only organizations that has really delved into the economics of what people call the disinformation industry. I don't like disinformation. I think it doesn't tell us what we're talking about, but let's talk about junk news for profit, propaganda, and weaponized information and influence operations. I'm going to use the term disinformation, but knowing what I mean, I think is important. So we have when they actually delved in to see who is funding this, who are doing these influence operations, and they made brands aware of that. They actually didn't necessarily want to advertise on those systems anymore. So that can be helpful. You also had entities like the Global GARM, the GARM, what did it stand for? Something about responsible advertising. Sorry, I forgot what the acronym stands for, but basically it was the World Association of advertisers got all the advertisers together and the platforms together to talk about brand safety because a lot of brands don't want their stuff to appear by CSAM or terrorist content or other types of problematic content, but maybe they do want to support news. So they did some transparency reporting to show where things were showing up and what happened. Musk's what was her name? Her second in command, they started attacking it, and they filed a lawsuit essentially claiming that there was collusion with advertisers not to advertise on X, even though that was, of course, not the case because advertising had already gone down because they're allowing a bunch of Nazis and extremist speech on the platform that advertisers didn't want to be near. So it's really challenging in the face of platform power, especially when you have trillionaires or trillion-dollar platforms in charge. Furthermore, let's be clear, the advertising system on which the digital economy is built is monopolized. We now have, the US court found that Google has an illegal monopoly over search advertising, the ad tech infrastructure, both sides of the market. The EU has found similarly. So, there's competition authorities around the world have also done investigations showing that level of control and monopoly. So, at least 30 cents of every dollar is going to monopoly rents. Same thing with platforms. You're trying to sell your subscription on an app, whether it's Apple or Google, 30% monopoly profits off the top. There's also been, and transparency is important because we can see that we actually don't even know where like 30 cents of every dollar is going, and Google also doesn't know. So you do need transparency, but you need more than transparency because and especially now as we're getting into the generative AI and digital advertising where it's even more opaque, we have so little insight into how those ads are being sold. They control both sides of the market. The platforms have all of the information about how much advertisers are willing to pay. They're able to undercut, what anyone else is offering. So it's just a completely distorted market, and it's shocking that even almost 2 decades in, we've still got this system. And now, we've had these efforts to have ad libraries, but why for only political ads? Again, very insufficient, and that had a negative impact of actually deterring civil society groups from being able to advertise on platforms. So I think we need, much more robust transparency for all types of advertising in multiple different levels, but we also need to break up we need to structurally separate control of the ad tech infrastructure, so you're not controlling the supply and the demand and all of the informational data.
Thank you. And then I guess staying on the line of, different ways to fund quality journalism. Kim, you've done a lot of work on this, and Canada has a history of subsidizing news, but looking at recent research, there are so many local and independent publishers that struggle to access or even navigate the existing support programs. So thinking about this policy history, how can funding mechanisms outside of advertising be redesigned so that they reach smaller, local, maybe even digital-first news?
Okay, I'm going to step back a little bit on that question and just sort of paint a bit of a context picture for us, because since 2018 up till October 1st, there were 603 local small newspapers, radio stations, media outlets, and online that have closed in 388 communities. That's a lot. But there's been 264 that opened and are still open. So that's about a third, another third all closed. But so you've got these. There's churn in the industry. There's innovation happening, and the innovation, the supports for the government that are happening. The labor tax credit. There's the local journalism initiative. There are all these programs that have in place, and I was there when they were started in 2020 when we started handing out money. And basically, there was it's the Tax Act. So if you look at the journalism, labor credit, you have to go through the Income Tax Act. They're the rules, and we were brought in as an independent panel, the first independent panel that CRA has ever had, probably still the only. And I left it about a year ago. And, but they are able to, provide money for online startups. And the requirement, though, is that there is a limit there because you have to have 2 employees that are arm's length. And that is a huge barrier for new startups to get in and to get that money. There are other programs as well, though. The Changing Narratives Fund that has just been introduced in the last year, the Canadian Media Fund, and there is the qualified donee status where you can become a charitable organization. And we've seen a lot of online startups with that, like Narwhal and others like that La Presse, which is an older, now online, they have gone that route as well. So there are, definitely options for this. I think that it gets a lot of criticism when we're talking about transparency. Because it's a government program, because it's through, the program I was with was through Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, and so people would say that there was bias there. And so we were 4 or 5 independent panel people that were brought in through the similar, somebody earlier talked about that the commissioner from the CRTC, had to go through a process in which, you apply and you get in. Well, some of our commissioners were brought in that way. The first panel was, I got a phone call. Would you like to do it? Me? How did you even find me? But it was very independent. We had a secretary. We have a secretariat. They're civil servants that work to provide the information we need to assess applications. Yes, the small startups. It's onerous, they're big applications, and I think that there could be ways in which you could help the smaller outlets coordinate their things, like having navigators, for instance, who could help them work through the maze of different government departments, Canadian Heritage. Then there's the News Media Canada with the local journalism initiatives, and also the Canadian Journalism Collective. So there's a lot of repetition that could be done. I think that this is only 5 years in for these things, and I think that there are growing pains and it is getting better. So I don't know that it's really that, I think that they're open to ideas for certain.
And then kind of connected to this and the importance of having, a diverse media ecosystem with multiple news outlets, I would like Danielle to talk about the role of the CBC, because on one hand, it can be seen as playing this unique role of providing a national baseline for coverage and, creating this public discourse. But at the same time, you could also think about it as generating some sort of unfair competition. So I was wondering if you could maybe share a bit more about the role of CBC and how it interacts with this need to sustain a more diverse media landscape.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'll just preface my response by saying I'm not an academic. I'm not an expert in this area. I am a lawyer at the CBC, so I really come to you just as somebody who lives and breathes public broadcasting on a day-to-day basis. So, you may disagree with what I have to say, and that's fine. One of the favorite pastimes of Canadians is to question the merit and value of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I have bought the T-shirt. I love the CBC, and that's why I work for the CBC. So, I'll start by saying, the CBC operates under the Federal Broadcasting Act, and its mandate is to enlighten, entertain, inform Canadians. But more importantly, the objective is, or the goal is to reflect the Canadian identity. So create that platform or that context in which we can both share a national discourse and enhance our understanding of what it is to be Canadian and what it means to live in Canada. So that is the overall objective of the CBC, which is much different from other entities which come from a profit-making perspective, right? That is the overall mandate of the CBC. So, we support national culture, we inform public debate, we supply news coverage that perhaps might be underserved in private markets. Now, what does that mean? There's various things that the CBC are doing, but it means that CBC content is not behind a paywall, and you will not have to pay any sort of subscriber fees or other fees in order to access CBC content. It means that you should be able to access CBC content no matter where you are and no matter who you are. It means that CBC has a strong objective to be present in the small regions of Canada, those regions that are perhaps underrepresented by other media organizations. And it means that CBC delivers news in both official languages and 7 other languages that are represented in Canada. You're not going to see other media outlets doing that, okay? It also means that CBC embraces new technologies. We want to be where the people are, whether that be on television, on radio. You will see that we're often the first to embrace new technologies. We're on TikTok. We were on Meta until they shut us down. We are embracing podcasting, right? So wherever we can be to ensure that people have the information they need from the CBC, we are investing in those new technologies and trying to be there. And also it means that we have an ombudsman. When we go back to transparency, we are transparent, but it also means that there's public accountability. If you have an issue with CBC and its content, there is an ombudsperson that you can complain to, and their decisions are public and available on the CBC's website. If there is an issue with anything that the CBC has broadcast, there will be corrections or updates issued on our content so that you're aware that we made a mistake and this is what we did wrong. So, there is a lot of transparency and there's a different priority at the CBC as opposed to other Canadian outlets. Now, I would say that that's platform diversity, content diversity, and source diversity. Now, how does that contribute to a diverse media? Well, first and foremost, we're not insular. We work with freelancers. We work with independent producers. We work with third parties in order to locate and develop Canadian content, not only on CBC platforms, but with partnerships as well, so that the content is also available on other platforms, okay? We spend our resources on Canadian-specific content as opposed to just purchasing American sitcoms or other content that you can get elsewhere, which is something I'm very proud of. When complaints about media competition come up, there's often complaints that, well, why is CBC in the business of advertising and other competition? Because we get government funding, so why should we be in that category as well? First and foremost, I'll say, and you all know, CBC is not the archenemy when it comes to advertising at this point. It's Meta, it's Google that is absorbing and taking all of that advertising content from other media organizations. And second of all, should the CBC abstain from commercial space or private media organizations? We can debate that, right? Should the CBC be bidding for broadcasting rights of the Olympics? Should we not leave that to other private organizations? Perhaps. But will another private media organization actually prioritize access over profit? Probably not. Will another media organization host viewing events across the country, in various broadcasting stations so everybody can get together to watch the gold medal hockey game? Probably not, and if they do, it's probably because the CBC set that precedent to do that. In terms of, other ways that we sort of facilitate the diversity of media organizations, I will say, my role at the CBC is a prime example of how we might facilitate work for others as well. I am a media lawyer. I am not the only media lawyer. We have a team of media lawyers at CBC that operate in every province and territory across this country. If you look at any of the most significant freedom of the press or free expression cases in this country, you will see that CBC is the one leading the charge. We're the ones that are defending freedom of expression. We're the ones that are advocating free press issues. And those cases are not for the benefit of CBC. They're for the benefit of all media organizations, no matter what their objective or what their goals are at the end of the day. So, while it could benefit the CBC, and it does benefit the CBC, I would say that it benefits all media organizations in this country at this point in time. So, we can debate whether or not the CBC is actually meeting its mandate, but I think it's very clear that we contribute to a diverse media organization, thank you, ecosystem in this country, and that we're very relevant.
Thank you. So you mentioned freedom of the press, and another thing that has been, mentioned both yesterday and today is that the press, journalists are constantly under attack. There's been a rise in harassment and silencing and overall threats to journalists across the world. Even, I think yesterday someone mentioned that even in Canada, we're just one election away from seeing, what is already happening in the United States and in other countries. So I would like some thoughts from all of you on how do we think about safeguarding quality journalism among all these challenges, especially in a system where virality drives attention, and often quality journalism loses to manipulated content on the virality battle. Thank you.
Well, I always think about anti-SLAPP legislation, because the chill factor. I think about the Section 2B having police actually being able to get training so that they know what are the rights of journalists and don't throw them in jail. I think that the organized media organizations need to stand up for their people and make sure that they're well protected, and I think they do. And there are journalists organizations around Canada that are taking, that actually are taking complaints, and they're posting through the Canadian Association of Journalists various violations that are happening to bring to the attention of the public about, because we're here for the public. Journalists don't do this. It's a great job. It was a great life when I was a journalist, but really, we're doing it for the public. This is what our role is to share information. And so we have to be safe, and our governments have to also stand up for us as well through stronger laws and regulations.
So I spent many years at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and one of the reasons I work on policy now is because it takes money to keep reporters safe. It takes money to train them how to do digital security or get delete me so they don't get online harassment, to make sure that you're not hiring freelancers to go to war zones who don't know what they're doing, and, news organizations working in, challenging environments, making sure they have backups and archives and all of that, all of that costs money, right? And so, your question around the virality thing, so we have now kind of just given over to a handful of U.S. Silicon Valley-based companies the vast majority of control over the digital information ecosystem, which is where more and more people are getting their information. So we know that people are getting news from social media, from search, and now increasingly from chatbots, all of which are dominated by Silicon Valley-based for-profit corporations, several of which are governed in ways that actually protect their chief executive from any sort of meaningful oversight, including by their board. We never talk about that in the discussion around press freedom, but for me, that is core. Because what did I see? I saw, I worked for this Bangladeshi photographer who was arrested and needed to get into his Twitter account to shut it down because the police had, been able to get in, and he wanted to have it shut down. Or Raqqa is being slaughtered silently was a citizen journalist group that when ISIS took over Raqqa and called it its capital, they were the only ones providing any alternative online to ISIS's narrative. So if you searched Raqqa before them, all you would get is ISIS propaganda. So then they needed to get verified on social media. They couldn't. There was no process. It was, people would literally, it was a life and death situation if you sent them a message on Twitter, because ISIS created a spoof account. And they had 5 members of their collective murdered. So I just see this, it's all very linked, right? You have, it's expensive to provide PPE, personal protective gear, whether you're talking about war zones or to cover a fire or to cover a pandemic. I think we've just really missed out on this idea, and what are the, virality then encourages the type of content that is engaging, which according to those algorithms tends to be extremist, polarizing, divisive. We have not designed the platforms or the business incentives to encourage good journalism. And actually, the European Commission just opened an investigation into Google because it was then, its inquiry shows that Google was deprioritizing news that had commercial elements on its website. So they're we're going to take your profits, and we're going to punish you if you try to find alternative revenue sources, right? So now we're in a situation where you have fewer media organizations, you have more media consolidation, you have news influencers, which is great. Let's get more people involved in the news, but ultimately they need that source, right? Which still comes from journalism. And we have, really, what is the economic model? I keep going to these journalism conferences and they're we got to find a new economic model, as if it's sitting out there in thin air, right? But you've got tech platforms that have now said, we're going to spend $1 million to hire AI engineers, billions of dollars to build data centers and buy chips. And we're not going to pay for any of the data on which we are building the generative AI systems that are taking over our information environment. So, but their products are bad and dangerous without access to quality information. So for example, NewsGuard did an analysis of chatbots. They are propagating Russian propaganda, all of them. Why? Because Russia is not putting its stuff behind paywalls. They're not trying to get licensing, of their content. And it's interesting with CBC because you have this mandate, to have your information out there publicly. But at the same time, then that also means those AI crawlers can just take all that information for free to create products that are directly competing with those quality information sources. And in the absence, as you all know, because I've been asking this question on every panel, in the absence of regulatory frameworks that separate out the power of, say, platforms to control the algorithm and the distribution and the production, in the absence of must-carry laws to require carrying of quality information or journalism, et cetera, there's so much centralized power in a handful of platforms and these U.S. corporations that have a direct implication on public interest media like CBC, which is here for the benefit of Canadians. And now you have those tech leaders kowtowing to an increasingly authoritarian, increasingly fascist leader. Literally, they are now appointed to positions in the military. They have subsidies from the government to build these data centers, this idea of AI innovation that they're pushing on anyone without saying, what are we innovating towards? If you cannot make any revenue from any lines of business, you can't reach your audience, how are you going to create the information that actually AI needs to run on? Models will collapse. We've gotten ourselves in this very dangerous cycle, and now you can create propaganda campaigns and target journalists with these very, very real-looking campaigns that make it really hard, and people don't want to do journalism anymore, just like they don't want to run for public office because you're going to get targeted, you're going to get attacked, they're going to create, deep fakes or not so deep fakes of you, and so for me, it's all wrapped up, right? It's so easy to focus on like the attacks on journalists, but you have to look at like this. It's all interrelated with how we govern the information platforms.
And if I could just build on that, because I agree with everything you've said, I think there's two real challenges here. One is availability. So it's a real issue when, for example, Meta is denying you access to CBC content, but any other publisher who is not, a recognized media organization is able to plaster its disinformation across the platform. And it really challenges this whole idea of a marketplace of ideas. You'll read everything and the truth will eventually come out. Well, if you're not getting that marketplace of ideas, you're just getting the disinformation, how will the truth ever rise, to the top? So that is a challenge. And similarly, as you say, AI is creating this issue where it takes our information. Not only does Google take our information to train its AI bot, but then the Google search results no longer show CBC at the top, but show the AI summary, right, of your question. So you're not going to click on cbc.ca, you're just going to read what the AI summary is and get your news from that, knowing that there can be problems with that as well. So one of the challenges is actually making sure the information is accessible. The other challenge, I think, is having an informed public that understands what are reliable news sources and what are not. And I'm afraid that, I don't know how we do that. And that is a real challenge.
Can I just ask you one quick question? Does Meta's bot crawl CBC content even though it blocks the content on their platforms?
All I can say is that there is currently litigation by CBC and other media organizations against the AI companies for using our content without permission.
Only OpenAI and Cohere, but anyways, somebody should look into whether Meta is taking media content to train its AI while blocking media content on its platforms. I think that would be fascinating.
It's interesting because, the Online News Act really forced media outlets, especially smaller ones, to rethink their whole business model, as you talk about it. And some interesting things are coming out at Spaces. Have you heard about Spaces? Village Media company has set up its own platform. It's kind of like a mixture of Facebook, Nextdoor, and Reddit. And it's integrated its 25 community newspapers into that so that the communities can go on and post things, share information, as well as receive news. And that was their answer to being shut out of the Meta and Facebook. And it's so far it's been quite successful. So you're seeing some innovation out of this. I don't know that it's a long-term answer, but they're trying to actually build a business model from that.
Okay, so if we can stay just a little bit more on the economic models. In Canada, as some of those initiatives were already mentioned, like tax credits to support employment of journalists, the Online News Act, there's been a lot of movement on government side to think of different ways to support journalism. There's been proposals thinking about taxing data collection, for example. I think Michael mentioned that as an option earlier. There's been, mandated collective bargaining in Australia and Canada. There's a lot of different alternatives out there. Now there's also the question mark, which is what to do when we not only have social media, but there's also the large language model companies that are further exploiting journalistic content. So I was wondering, there's a lot of trade-offs in these options. If you could, maybe share your thoughts on the pros and cons and what could work. Is there even just one solution that should be advanced? Are we thinking of, tackling the issue from multiple perspectives? And I think this matters because, at least from what I've seen happening in the US, there is very little political will in the US context. In other countries, there's a lot more political will, but it's also very challenging to gather consensus around measures. Yeah, curious to know your thoughts.
I think there's no one silver bullet. I think you have to address the structure of the market. So you need to enforce competition policy. So prevent self-preferencing on the platforms, prevent discrimination. If you are an information provider that holds yourself open to all users, you should not be allowed to discriminate against one category of users, like news publishers. Like, that just seems very clear. Redressing market imbalances by allowing collective bargaining, enforcing existing laws like copyright, which is in most countries an existing law. Some countries have fair use or fair dealing exceptions, which, in my opinion, this does not meet. And you have to look at maybe like training versus some of the grounding, but for sure, grounding, which is, if you remember when ChatGPT first started, you couldn't ask it anything before 2021 or it would get it wrong. So they created this new thing called retrieval augmented generation to go out and get more accurate, timely information. That just is very clearly not a fair use or fair dealing, because it is literally copying that information and it's creating a market replacement. So, we have existing laws that we can and should enforce in order to, balance the market. And I think that is for me most important now coming. So I've worked most of my career in authoritarian countries, and I worked as a journalist in the Middle East. I got fired from a Saudi-owned news outlet because I wrote an article about safety problems on the national airline. So, you need a plural, we talked about pluralism earlier, right? You need multiple types of funding and revenue sources for media. You need commercial, private advertising, sponsorships, government support, but you need the market, you need the rules by which everyone is playing to be fair, right? I think that is the most important thing. And so, we've seen that now with the illegal monopoly cases against Google, right? So illegal monopoly in search, that is how we find information. 90% of most countries' search market dominated by Google. Same thing with the ad tech, as mentioned earlier, and with the app stores. So, starting to break up these monopolies. And unfortunately, this idea that AI is so technically complex and it's so new and we can't possibly regulate it is really problematic and only works in, these corporations' interests. Because in fact, when you looked at the remedies from the Google monopoly trial, we and many others, including the Department of Justice, had said, you should prevent Google from using data collected in search to help secure its monopoly in generative AI, and they did not propose that. And so, I think a lot of people were really disappointed by that. Similarly, they did not request they did not demand the breakup of Chrome. I mean, these companies, and I think part of that is because we have this, too narrow concept of a market and a lack of imagination where, we can't even think about how would we not algorithmically interfere. But you've got things like Blue Sky, right, where you've got a platform that allows others to, put their algorithms on it in order to curate. So you've separated out the hosting from the curation. So I think we need a whole panoply of policy solutions, and we do not have time to wait and see what happens with AI, because you've got trillion-dollar companies that are spending more money than God in DC and in Brussels, where you have the market power and political power to actually rein in some of that power.
I just want to add one other thing, and that is the whole idea of taxation as a way of funding journalism. There are pros and cons to that, just from my experience at the CBC. The pro, of course, is that then journalism is seen as a public good. which is not a bad thing. The con, of course, is that nobody wants more taxes, and then journalism becomes an enemy. So I don't think there's any obvious answer to any of the proposed solutions at this point. And of course, another challenge, and I don't want to get into whether or not journalists should be licensed, but, anyone can be a journalist in this day and age. So, how do you confine and dictate who gets funding and who does not? That's also a real challenge that we're dealing with right now.
Certainly, most of the funding from the government, from our taxpayers' dollars, goes to media organizations, and they're very clear about what the criteria are for that. So that's sort of, I think if you're doing independent media, you have to really look at what they're doing. Are they doing news? Are they contributing to the public discourse? Are they adding value in our communities? And I would really like to see, we have news deserts. There's places across Canada in Nova Scotia where we don't have coverage of municipal politics. We don't hear about the school boards. We don't hear about that. And the studies have shown that without that kind of coverage, civic participation in elections, in civic life drops dramatically. Rural areas, there's no reason to stay in rural areas. People move out. So I mean, an important part of our democracy and of our health of our communities, if we don't even want to use the D word, is in fact, a strong, healthy media, whatever it is, an online or audio or video, that kind of thing.
Can I just say one more thing about taxes? I mean, I think that if you just made the companies pay their regular taxes, you wouldn't need to raise taxes on citizens, right? And in the UK, they have a device tax, and a couple of other countries, I don't remember, I think there's one in, I don't remember which one it is, but they tax, you could look at like taxing the internet router, or, so in the UK it's the TV, but you could look at the internet router or the phone or something that is essentially part of this information, device, and you could look at how you could then allocate that to media organizations. And I think it's, the most important thing there then is how do you prevent political capture, right? And we're seeing this in Turkey, for example, where they're considering a news media bargaining code like Australia and Canada, but, they're only going to favor the pro-regime media. And as a side note, this person I met who's done research in Turkey showed that Google's search results is favoring pro-regime media, right? And so now, how, as if you're an independent media organization, how do we even compete there, right? So.
I mean, Turkey is not necessarily known for its great democracy, so it's bound to sort of lean that way. So I mean, but in in Canada anyway, I won't say North America. For now, I mean, you can an arm's length independent panels like the Journalism Collective is handing out the Google money. They're away from.
You said there are 5 of you?
No, that's a different group.
We have had independent regulators and independent chairs in the United States, and most of them have been fired. Our Supreme Court has held up the ability of the executive to fire them. So I think we need to think even more robustly.
Well, perhaps, yeah. I mean, right now, for instance, the independent panel is appointed, you're right, by Privy Council, but no one interferes in any of our decisions, including the Journalism Secretariat that we're doing the work for, is CRA. So there is that sense of independence. And with the Canadian Journalism Collective, they are a bunch of media organizations, and everyone has criteria, and they follow the criteria. And if there were any interference, hell would be to pay.
But that's the thing is because journalism has its own professional organizations, you could set up a way to identify, which media organizations get a benefit based on a self-regulatory mechanism, right? Because it is an unlicensed profession. You could do it in that way. And I think, I hear you that there's an arm's length, but again, coming from a country where it never would have occurred to me that we would be in the situation we are in now, really making sure that you're thinking about the worst case scenario is probably a good idea at this point.
All right, I have a lot more questions, but I would like to give the opportunity to the public while we have some time.
I think we just go ahead first.
multitasking.
I don't really need it, but I think the recording needs it, right?
Hi, I'm Katie Stilegi. I'm a law professor at the University of Manitoba. Thank you so much for this thoughtful conversation. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. Danielle, I'm really glad you brought up the idea of like the search engine optimization pages and the sourceless information that we see more and more online. It's something that I've been really concerned about the last couple of years in terms of how people are getting their information and what that looks like when we aren't able to allocate it to a source. And that's something that I think is getting worse and worse with the advent of generative AI and what people are calling work slop, right? This idea of just producing big bits of language and, you know, devil may care whether it's accurate or whatever. And I would love to hear your perspective on the role of journalists in preserving integrity of information in that open media ecosystem. And just as a personal anecdote, right, my specialty is in AI and the law. I'm the only person who does that in Manitoba. I get calls from the media all the time. And I'm not going to call anybody out, right? It's like CTV, Global, CBC. Sometimes people call me from the Canadian Press. People call me from other provinces. It's not just local media. But more and more often, when I see the pieces that come out of those interviews, it feels to me like the piece was written before I ever spoke to the journalist. There's one quote that they want from me. Sometimes it's something I said in passing, as opposed to the like 30-minute in-depth conversation that we had. And that worries me because then what distinguishes high-quality human-written journalism from the work slop, right? Like how do we create a world where we care about that integrity and we care about what's written by people?
Mm-hmm. I think it's very difficult. I wish I had an obvious answer for you, right? The CBC works very hard with integrity to ensure that the public knows exactly how we do our stories and why we do them. And, you know, even if there's a 30-second clip of you on the news, we might broadcast the full interview online so that you can see it in context. But I just don't know how you force others to do that. All I can say is, you know, the CBC tries to be the gold standard and tries to operate in a way that other media organizations will follow suit, and very often some do, but those who don't care about the integrity of the journalism will not. So it is a real challenge. I'm not sure, Kim, if you have anything else to add. I agree with you. Okay.
A couple of you spoke in a couple of different ways, Courtney and Danielle specifically, about the systemic challenges that media faces and like the media industry faces on the whole, and say like the citizenry's general loss of trust in media institutions over the past number of years. And to be sure, there is the responsibility of the system itself to correct for that, no doubt. Courtney, down in your neck of the woods, you know, the IAB Tech Lab continues to, you know, throw up their smoke and mirrors and magic to, you know, obfuscate what's going on with programmatic advertising. But to be sure, institutions, you know, bear at least some of the responsibility as well. So to that end, you know, being in Canada, I'm reminded of the 1907 Quebec bridge collapse, and you know how in the years that followed that, it basically gave rise to a movement to establish the PEng designation or license with the engineering profession. So curious, like given the similar, you know, collapse of trust in media over, you know, especially over the past 10 to 15 years. You know, has meaningful effort been invested into the idea of, say, like a voluntary professional standard for journalists that's perhaps like, you know, not, you know, perhaps like graded on the idea of holding fast to objective, factual-based reporting, you know, across the the ideological, spectrum, that, journalists don't necessarily need to be mandated to adhere to, but at least, can signal that they themselves as individual journalists hold to a higher standard, so that, not every, Joe and Jane Smith, from the street can self-label as a journalist and water down the, what that means as a profession.
I do not think that's the problem. Honestly, I don't think the problem is like you have people calling themselves journalists and then that's watered down trust. Trust has declined in every single institution, including media. So there's a general decline in trust that I think is more due in part to the environment. I think it is much more useful to think at the institutional level as opposed to the individual journalist level. So I did my doctoral research in Egypt, where you have institutional press and you have professional journalists. But you know who did the best reporting in the lead up to the Arab revolutions? It was the citizen journalists on the street reporting on police violence. Same here, right? We have people reporting on violence, on community issues that might not be covered by the mainstream press. So I don't think it's an issue of like people calling themselves journalists. Are there people who call themselves journalists who aren't doing journalism? Sure. Is that why we have the decline in trust? I don't think so. I think it's because we have an algorithmically inflected information environment that is driving the commercial media to play to the algorithm so that they can make money, which leads to crappy news. And you have the rise of, people in power who spew disinformation, inaccurate information, conspiracy theories, et cetera. Like, you can be the best journalist ever, but if you've got to cover the BS that Trump or, the Secretary of Health just said about vaccines, like, what are you going to do, right?
It's true that it works both ways, right? Of course, like, media, media chases traffic, but it's sensationalist advertising, or at least, like, it's easy enough to drive more clicks with sensationalist advertising. So there's a bit of a perverse incentive.
Right, exactly.
Journalists that don't uphold to that standard.
But to your question around there actually are a lot of industry initiatives. There's the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is run by Reporters Without Borders. There's the Trust Project by Sally Lehman in the US. There's actually a plethora. And in fact, if I remember correctly, Alessia and I did a research project about that at UCLA, so I'm happy to share that with you. So there are a lot of those things where you can go through essentially these, self-regulatory voluntary codes of conduct and then get that, stamp of approval or whatever, which is good because I certainly don't want any government deciding what are the standards that should be, that need to be abided by. And so but then the question is, okay, how do you think about whether or not those media organizations who have that stamp of trust should or shouldn't be, say, amplified or prioritized in the information environment. So it was really interesting because, like, when the Ukraine invasion happened, Facebook reached out to a bunch of us who work in, like, with independent media in Ukraine and Russia to say, like, hey, we're blocking all these sites, including news sites, but we need help figuring out who is legitimate and who isn't legitimate, which is, like, great on one hand. On the other hand, super opaque and, like, not transparent and really problematic to randomly call up, a handful of experts. I mean, happy, but bad. So, we tried to then set up a mechanism and think about, okay, well, how could you make this a more accountable, more transparent, and how can we protect, legitimate news sites, and what are the, also making sure that there's not only one standard. And that's, again, the great thing about journalism is we have, as a profession, a lot of self-regulatory standards. So what I would do is I would say, all right, here are the standards that are kind of like recognized by the industry. Here are, say, 10 different options. Here are all of the different, like, press associations, journalist associations, accrediting bodies. And you could say, okay, well, if you belong to any one of these or you adhere to any one of these, you get access to this tax funding, or you get, labeled as a media entity on this platform, and you have access to, say, the European Media Freedom Act for prioritization, or, I think there's a lot of really creative ways, but it's complicated. and it requires the journalism community to come together in a way that they're really bad at doing, right?
Sure that I understand, you would warn against one single.
I would, yeah,
standards bearer.
yes.
It also just won't apply for everyone, right? The same standards can't, I was part of a conference a few months ago where we were talking about whether or not there should be universal journalistic standards, not just for Canada, but globally, right? One of the sort of primary standards here in Canada is the right of reply. So if you're writing about a subject, you give that subject the opportunity to respond. But somebody from another country said that would never fly in our country. If we gave them the right to respond, we'd be killed and the story would never be published. So it's very difficult to have a universal set of standards. It really is dependent on, the context in which you're writing. But I just go back, I support everything that you've said. And, if it really was just about standards, then we wouldn't have this massive movement to defund the CBC or calling CBC fake news, right? We really do have the gold standard of journalistic ethics and standards. We have a robust fact-checking system. We have in-house lawyers that vet things to ensure that they're, legally sound. And yet we still have massive campaigns saying that we're fake news and defund the CBC. So I don't think it's just about standards.
It's okay. Okay. So one of the pressures on publishers that you mentioned.
Hold it closer to your mouth.
Is it on?
Yeah, you just need to hold it closer.
I think it is. It's just me. Sorry. So one of the pressures on publishers that you mentioned in passing is AI summaries, and like the fact that they're drawing a lot of traffic away from publishers' sites. Some of us may be aware here that at the moment at the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, there's a movement, there's a discussion about coming up with a new set of protocols that would enable publishers to signal that they don't want to be, crawled for that purpose. They want to sort of have more minute distinctions between crawling for search, crawling for training data, and crawling for this purpose. So my question is twofold. What would you say to the argument that, now, as you may be aware, Danielle mentioned that there are lawsuits. So around the world, there are a few lawsuits right now saying, hey, when you summarize our stuff, you're copying it verbatim, that's infringement. Now, that may be true in some cases, but my question is, ultimately, you can't make these things go away. I mean, at least on some level, a summary is fair use, fair dealing. So, what's your position on that? My second question is, how do you think publishers should respond to this phenomenon to deal with the diversion of traffic?
Sure. So I'm part of the IETF working group on that, and the problem is the publishers would like to have more granular instructions. However, let's remember this is only about robots.txt or some sort of replacement, which is a do not trespass sign. It is not a barrier or offense, so that's fundamentally different, and we know that many tech companies are bypassing that instruction, or they're buying data from third parties that are bypassing that. So it's insufficient. And also, if you can't currently, because Google does not distinguish between search crawler and AI crawler, you can't legitimately differentiate between those two without cannibalizing search traffic, which no one can afford to do. So unless you have structural separation and you have anti-retaliation provisions that would prevent Google from retaliating against publishers that block its AI crawler, I don't think that's going to be the solution. So then you have companies like Cloudflare, which controls about 20% or touches about 20% of global internet traffic, saying, okay, well, we're going to default to blocking AI crawlers. which I think on the one hand, as a short-term solution, it's good, because if there's no scarcity of quality content, it's easy for the AI crawlers to just take it. And why should the default just be to make it open? So I think in the short term, personally, I think every publisher has to take a bullet for the greater good, which is block AI crawlers. The problem is that then means that there is no quality information out there, but maybe we need to see what happens in order to get policymakers to require that if you're going to have a product, you have to have one of the ingredients. If you have a chatbot or a summarization product, one of the ingredients has to be news or journalism or human created content, whatever you want to define that as. Just the way we say, like, if you want to create baby food, you know, you have to have these ingredients. If you want to make a car, you have to have these components. Like, why we've decided not to do that for AI products, I do not understand, because they're dangerous and bad if you don't have that quality information, but you cannot continue to provide that without people, you know, without hiring. However, what are we going to see happening? I already talked to this one tech firm. This is dystopic, people. So it's an AI firm that has partnered to go into local communities and get the transcripts from city council meetings, anything that's digitized, and use their AI product to make sense of that information, and then hire one editor that can essentially be the editor for 20 hyperlocal newsrooms, and, you know, have oversight of the AI generated content, which is now serving as news in those news deserts. You know, I guess that's maybe better than nothing, but also that's not a solution. And so I think we are really at this is not, we don't have 5 years, we don't even have probably 2 years to figure this out. There are 54 lawsuits, almost all of them are in the US, there are 2 in Canada, 1 in the UK, 1 in India, 1 in France. We should see way more lawsuits, and I've advised Canadian publishers on this: license, litigate, legislate. You need licensing. There's an AI licensing market that's burgeoning. You need to have a marketplace for that. They need to be required to. The small AI startups cannot afford the legal lack of clarity. So they want a licensing market, right? And we're learning that scale is not necessarily better for AI. It's also incredibly environmentally detrimental. So it's in our interest to encourage licensing and smaller models. You need to litigate. We need way more lawsuits. Why do we not have Napster anymore? Because you had lawsuits, and we need litigation, right? You need legislation to set the rules of the road. And I think, again, why you're just allowed to create these products that are there are so many, if you go on the ChatGPT store, you can get all these AI newspapers. And so it's going to go to the CBC, it's going to go to, your favorite news, and it's going to take it and summarize it. But I mean, that's not a legal use. That should not be, in my opinion, right now, a legal use of this sort of thing.
I think it's also very short-sighted on the part of the public and on these AI companies. Right now, it's very convenient for the public to get a short summary, and they use it, and they like it. And right now, AI has lots of resources to feed their AI system. But if you've effectively cut off the revenue of news organizations and you've cut off the eyeballs on their websites or other platforms, they're not going to be producing content anymore. So what is AI going to be pulling from in the future? It's a very scary situation.
And you just had that BBC report that came out that showed, don't quote me on this, but I think it was 46% error rate. Right, I know that the industry calls it hallucinations, but it's an error rate on news summarization. So these are very flawed tools, and if we get away from this anthropomorphizing of AI and we talk about hallucinations as error rates, we can say, all right, well, here's an acceptable error rate for this type of product. And, we can also then have better discussions with the public. And to that issue of trust is don't trust the AI, right? Their error rates are really bad, even worse than that journalist who quoted you and didn't take the part that you wanted, right?
I think as well, just with AI, as you said, Kim, it's more like stenography than journalism. And, it's fine if you're just looking for certain facts, but the impact of journalism really is on how you create an impact with the storytelling and the characters that you find to tell the story and convey the message. And AI doesn't do any of that. So whether or not it's actually going to resonate with the community and deliver the information in a way that's important and impactful, I really question that.
So thanks for the panel. This is such an important topic, and I think it's really clear that the state of journalism is really at the heart of what ails a lot of our society. So there's a lot of really interesting topics being broached, and I think it's clear that there's a smorgasbord of solutions that are going to be on the table, from whether it's tax credits for organizations to support this type of work, a strong national broadcaster, litigation. My question's for Danielle, because, and I'm framing the question a little bit like Professor Skass's question to the Justice Minister this morning. I'm trying to reconcile some of the comments you made. You made this comment earlier that the CBC is not behind a paywall and you should be able to access CBC no matter where you are, no matter who you are. I couldn't agree more with that. But in fact, the CBC does have a paywall, especially for CBC Gem, where there's a two-tier system, right? There's a free version that uses ads, ads that actually suck up advertising revenue from the rest of the Canadian information ecosystem and actually actively harm independent media outlets. And then there's a second tier, which is ad-free, which you do have to pay for. And, I'm a believer in a national broadcaster that is strong, free, and accessible. But I'm also the respondent in a lawsuit where the CBC is suing me because I've asked how many people subscribe to CBC Gem. And so as much as we talk about needing a strong broadcaster, one of my real concerns is around how the CBC chooses to spend its money. This is an unparalleled institution when it comes to its resources to engage in fact-based journalism, access to information filing, freedom of information request filing, and so forth. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what the expectations of taxpayers will be around the transparency of a national broadcaster to see what results come from the funding it receives when it decides to engage in these types of high capital or capital intensive projects that produce entertainment of value that we might be able to ascertain by seeing viewer subscription numbers and other types of metrics. I mean, these go to the heart of basic accountability measures. So I just wonder if you could expand some of your thoughts on transparency obligations for publicly funded broadcasters. I understand there's give and take. I'd just be very curious to hear, not talking about the litigation, but talking about what are those obligations truly? What should animate them?
So I think that's way beyond my pay grade to answer, specifically. But what I can say is I think that we recognize that there has to be transparency in terms of how money is spent. And there are, of course, exceptions to that. And there are debates around those exceptions that we create. When you talk about the CBC suing you, do I understand that perhaps you made an access request and the CBC is denying the access request? Is that correct?
Yeah, so I made a request over a year ago, and the CBC was ordered by the Information Commissioner to disclose the information to me rather than adhere to the Commissioner's order. And I should add that this is a power that is supposed to be very helpful for journalists. When it was introduced in 2019, the animus was to support journalists. It's a little disturbing that the CBC now sees its mission as challenging those orders by suing the requester and the Information Commissioner in court. So about 3 weeks ago, I had a process server knock on my door, and CBC is apparently paying Blake's to sue me to block the order from coming into effect.
Okay. So I'm not part of that case, and I can't comment on that case, but it sounds to me like they're not suing you, they're challenging the Privacy Commissioner's order.
I have to go to court to defend my interests in the case. So, in fact, it's a lawsuit, and I am a named respondent to the suit.
Okay, so what I can say is when the CBC makes decisions to challenge questions, access questions or other things, it comes down to a public interest consideration. So is it just about your request, or is there a greater public interest issue that's at play? And so very often when the CBC is not transparent about something, I think there's some public interest that they're considering when taking that position. But overall, I can only say that my experience and my knowledge is that CBC tries to be transparent as it can be, to the extent that it doesn't even wait for access requests. It publishes information about funding and other details directly on its website. Should it be transparent? If you're asking me my personal opinion, not as a CBC lawyer or somebody else, as a public broadcaster, I think there is an obligation to be transparent to a certain extent. But there are always exceptions to that rule, and I think there's a lot of thought given before we apply one of those exceptions.
So I've been a journalist. I'm currently working in the access to information and privacy field, and I teach at Dalhousie here. And it just seems to me, following up on the transparency question of my colleague behind me and Courtney's comment about the BBC study, there is a history here. There was a study done many, many years ago called the Gatekeeper Study that was a very prominent communication study. I think it was out of the University of Illinois in the communications area. And what they did is they took an editor, a news editor at a major newspaper in Chicago, and they had the wire service machines, which in those days, most of the news that was generated internationally would come in through wire service machines. And they looked at the choices that the news editor made in terms of what stories would go into the paper and what stories wouldn't. And they were able to develop a profile of the newspaper preferences, if they thought it was conservative, if they thought there was this, they thought there was that. It was a remarkable study, and it seems to me, in the transparency area, there's a lot of weapons that can be used to do some of the refinements we talked about here today. That is, in terms of all the news that's out there from the wire services, all the news that's available publicly across the globe, to look at what these channels, these mega channels in terms of distributing news information use. And in the end, you will come up with a profile of what their preferences are in a transparent way, and also what their philosophy is, et cetera. And to me, when you publish that transparency, it might provide a test for people making judgments about what mega organizations on the internet are using in terms of stories. Because I think that's really important for people to know where the truth is. The thing that has not been discussed, and we talked about misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. What is truth now? Truth has become a relative term in today's society. And that is a problem, a serious problem. And I think people need to be able to make judgments based on actual statistical evidence in terms of what stories are being printed, in terms of the news capacity around the world in today's society.
I want to ask a question with regard to the case, that pending case against OpenAI. And you touched a little bit on this, and I understand that there might be limitations to share here. But what I find a little bit difficult to navigate or concerning is, how can we talk about content that is made for the public interest and public, and at the same time control how this data is going to be used by various AI systems? And why I'm saying that is that if we're worried that content that is not misinformation is not generated from the chatbots that a lot of people are using today, shouldn't we make sure that all of this curated content is actually represented? or shouldn't we make sure that other companies, and that's probably what's mostly what mostly drives my concern here, that want to compete with OpenAI, that want to compete with the big AI companies and offer alternative solutions to consumers, that they do have access to this data. Because I get it from the perspective of, you know, Toronto Star and other media companies that are not bound and don't have the public interest mission that CBC has. But I have the same, you know, view on Kindly, for example, the legal information database that is in case way. Why aren't we supporting more access to good content rather than less? Is this something you could comment on from the perspective of CBC and from the perspective of the different model that CBC
It's
follows?
difficult for me to comment on that. You know, I think the only thing I can say is it's not just about public access to information. It's about a commercial gain as a result, you know, commercially benefiting from the work of others, right? So it's not just about making the information publicly available, but I would say, you know, there's a distinction between providing information for the public good and providing information for your own commercial gain.
Can I also add to that? Because I think there is, you know, what distance are you taking? Because you could say it's not in the public good because the chatbots don't have access to that information. But if you take a step back, you can say, actually, it's not in the public good to make that information available for a short-term thing like chatbot responses when it's potentially contributing to the decimation of journalism as a sector and a viable economic, you know, so it's not, I think it's just not clear, right?
We never had the control over how will, you know, third parties use this kind of information. What makes the situation, you know, so novel now that we want this kind of control? That's
well, I mean, but we have copyright laws that actually you have not been able to go into, you know, the library and make photocopies of all the books, and
yes,
then
and ultimately you did, and Google Books had it, trust. Why did Google get away with the mass scanning project, and we should not think about the OpenAI case in the same way? And I'm not advocating necessarily for that, but we have this is a double standard in this case, and yeah, also.
well, I mean, I think one of the big differences is there, to her point, is like there wasn't a commercial, the Google Books specifically only showing portion, and they're not monetizing it directly. They're linking to Barnes & Noble or to, you know, Kindle or whatever so that you can buy the book. There's no requirement for compensation, for credit, for referral or anything. So I think it's fundamentally different. And it's not precluding, say, a nonprofit. So in Switzerland, they actually created a fully rights-respecting LLM that uses only public domain or licensed data. So you could say, okay, well, maybe it's going to be available to nonprofit developers that are not doing it for commercial reasons, right? But I think, I mean, since I know you can only say so much, but I think the commercial aspect is like really fundamental.
I agree with you, although Google did have a commercial gain out of the digitization
absolutely.
process, 100%. And also, we're talking about licensed content that is not accessible to everyone. And that's why I want to separate CBC, or to a certain extent. Information is not freely available when you think about the rest of the media.
Start strong and end strong. That's what I always say. Please join me in thanking our panelists.